Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I've enjoyed the talks that I heard yesterday, so I look forward to the rest of them today as well. On January 7th, 1955, Marian Anderson made her debut at the Metropolitan Opera, becoming the first singer of color to take a principal role with the famous company, which was then 75 years old. The Met has so far avoided a full-scale examination of the racist history that led to such a late breakthrough. And it has also managed to sidestep the term Jim Crow. Yet for a very long time, the rubric applied. In States' Laws on Race and Color, a landmark book from 1951, the civil rights attorney, Pauli Murray, wrote that Jim Crow represented the pattern of discrimination and segregation in evidence to a greater or lesser degree throughout the nation. The Met's history definitely fits that pattern. When Anderson debuted at the Met, she was assigned the role of Ulrika in Verdi's The Masked Ball. The character is a witch, which meant that Anderson wore a frightful black wig and stirred an immense cauldron with a skull at her feet. The libretto described Ulrika as possessing, quote, the foul blood of the Negroes. That word appears frequently in my sources today. It was common during Anderson's career, and I will be quoting it. Thus, while Anderson's debut carried enormous symbolic significance, her role essentially amounted to blackface. Today, I'm exploring the alliance of forces, including especially Anderson's manager, Saul Hurok, and Walter White of the NAACP, that played a long game over several decades to force Anderson's Met debut. All this is part of a book I'm writing about the racial segregation of classical music performance in the mid-20th century. My goal is to contextualize legacies of white supremacy while exploring isolated moments when performers of color breached Jim Crow. If this story has been told, it has mostly been articulated as a redemptive narrative of breakthroughs, ignoring the persistent patterns of exclusion that preceded change. This research is possible in part because Black newspapers and the NAACP's archive have been digitized. Plus, Anderson's archive at Penn is extraordinary in size and scope, including many of her beautiful dresses. Marian Anderson's youth unfolded here in Philadelphia during the opening decades of the 20th century, and she began her career within an active network of African American classical music, performing at Black churches and Black high schools, historically Black colleges, and Black Masonic temples. This morning, however, I foreground Anderson's involvement in interracial performance. To get us oriented with her stage presence and musical authority, here is a clip of her performing an African American spiritual at the height of her career in 1950 with her longtime accompanist, Franz Rupp. Anderson routinely ended her concerts with a group of spirituals, which, in her bearing and interpretation, she treated like an extension of European art songs.
He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the big round world in his hands. He's got the wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the sun and the moonlight in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the lion man right in his hands. He's got the gambling man in his hands. He's got the crap shooting man in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me. Right in his hands he's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. Oh, he's got everybody here. In his hands he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody here. Right in his hands he's got the whole world in his hands.
Let's step back to the 1920s to chart Marian Anderson's long road to the Met. Anderson's emergence within elite white concert organizations occurred improbably, given the restrictions of Jim Crow segregation. In July 1925, at age 28, she won a vocal competition sponsored by the recently formed National Music League and the New York Philharmonic's Stadium Concerts, a summertime series held in Lewiston Stadium at City College in Harlem. Anderson triumphed as one of 3 winners among a field of 300 contestants, the rest of whom were white. The prize was a debut with the Philharmonic at the stadium. Such events are difficult to contextualize, since there is no overarching history to document the scattershot moments when African American performers broke through Jim Crow to appear as soloists with prestigious white orchestras and opera companies. Yet each case chipped away at white supremacy, opening a space in which white institutions of classical music began to imagine interracial performance. Such events were isolated with little momentum towards overall inclusion. With Anderson's Philharmonic debut at the Stadium in 1925, it occurred within a small cluster of recent high-profile breakthroughs by the black tenor Roland Hayes. In November 1923 with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and in March 1925 with the New York Philharmonic. These concerts with Hayes fit the halting pattern of integration just described. Yet they were of note not only because they happened, but because they did so in Symphony Hall and Carnegie Hall, both indoor, high-prestige sites, overwhelmingly white in their featured performers and audiences. After Anderson's debut with the Philharmonic at the Stadium, that outdoor venue continued to include a reasonable number of African American performers, and it did so over the years. The Philharmonic subscription concerts in Carnegie Hall, however, were another matter. Following the appearance there of Roland Hayes in 1925, the next black performer featured by the Philharmonic in Carnegie Hall appears to have been Anderson 21 years later in 1946, followed by William Warfield another decade later in 1956. These Jim Crow practices in New York City ran parallel to those in the South. While less flagrant, they were still exclusionary. For Anderson, the most well-known racial incident in her career occurred in Washington, D.C. in 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution exercised the whites-only clause in their contracts and refused to let her perform at Constitution Hall. This exclusion occurred 3 decades before the Kennedy Center opened, when Constitution Hall was Washington's central performance facility, home to the National Symphony Orchestra and the Washington Opera. To challenge the DAR, a coalition of the NAACP, representatives from Howard University, and Anderson's manager, Saul Hurok, together with the support of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, relocated the concert to the Lincoln Memorial, that is, an alternative outdoor space related to the open-air seating of Lewiston Stadium. The crowd at the Lincoln Memorial was proudly interracial, and Anderson's transcontinental broadcast, heard by millions, further diversified its audience. Anderson's 1939 concert is now recognized as a landmark in the campaign for equal access to public facilities. But the battle wasn't over, especially in her long-running exclusion from the Metropolitan Opera. Increasingly, Saul Hurok assumed the role of manager-activist, while Anderson shaped her own mode of protest. That is, she showed up over and over again in racially charged settings and did so with all the trappings of a concert artist. Against this backdrop, I turn now to the Metropolitan Opera Company, and I'm advancing a theory that Anderson and Hurok employed the strategy of renting prestigious facilities when the elite performance organizations affiliated with those venues closed them out through race-based exclusions. This was certainly the case at the old Metropolitan Opera building on Broadway between 39th and 40th Street, a building razed in 1967 after the construction of Lincoln Center. Anderson's debut in 1955 with the Metropolitan Opera Company did not simply appear as an admirable opening of minds, but resulted from a multi-year lobbying campaign in which rental of the building quickly developed into a cunning means of achieving an elusive goal. Beginning in April 1943, Anderson, with Hurok as strategist, regularly asserted her presence on the Met stage using rental as her weapon. That is, she physically occupied the space, filling the house with her glorious voice in spite of the company's prejudices, and opening the audience to her fellow African Americans, who really turned out. She included opera arias, as with the Donizetti aria highlighted here. Doing so asserted her right to that repertory, pushing back on the Met's whites-only agenda. In chronicling the civil rights movement in post-war New York, the historian Martha Biondi points out that the city's racial segregation was at odds with the popular image of liberal Manhattan, and she documents a striking degree of formalized racial discrimination and segregation in public accommodations, transportation, housing, employment, and schools, as well as in the culture industries. Anderson and Hurok had a one-year hiatus at the Met, and they resumed their campaign with concerts on Sunday afternoons in April of 1945 and 46. Then in 1947, Hurok landed the booking he must have wanted all along. Not only was Anderson's rental of the Met on a Sunday in April, but it took place on Easter, which then became an annual event. It was a brilliant stroke. Anderson's triumph at the Lincoln Memorial had occurred on Easter Sunday, and her standing room concerts at the Met identified her even more intensely with the Christian symbolism of that day. Anderson also presented Easter concerts at the Met in 1948 and 49. While the Met's anti-Black racism held firm, the Black press waged an ongoing campaign against its exclusionary practices. In 1940, for example, the Amsterdam News noted an appearance at the stadium concerts by Anderson and soprano Kirsten Flogstad, and it called out the Met. However, despite her undisputed qualifications, American-born Miss Anderson has never been invited to sing with the Metropolitan Opera Company, while Miss Flogstad has been accorded every courtesy this country can give an artist. In decrying the Met's practices, another striking voice came from a white writer for the New York Times, that is Howard Taubman, who in 1943, the same year as Anderson's first solo concert on the Met stage, published a book for fans of classical music with a chapter titled The Negro in Music. There he let loose about racial realities that were otherwise not being acknowledged by whites. How can we expect a hospitable approach to the Negro musician from the Metropolitan Opera House when some of its patrons will not even tolerate the presence of a Negro in an adjacent seat? If Negro customers buy tickets directly from the box office, precautions are taken to give them aisle seats and to tear up the ticket for the neighboring seat so that no white patron will have to rub shoulders with a Negro. A now famous event on Anderson's road to the Met occurred in May 1950 when she sailed on the Queen Elizabeth for a concert tour of Europe and South America, and did so on the same ship as Rudolph Bing, the recently appointed general manager of the Met. That meeting was thoroughly staged by Hurok, culminating a series of such efforts. Back in 1946, for example, he organized a midnight supper for Anderson and included Edward Johnson, then director of the Met, who attended but never altered his Jim Crow policy. Bing's appointment made a difference at the same time as his role as a savior-like figure has been overblown. This was a collaborative effort, with Hurok shaping the strategy and Anderson turning up to sing. Thus, in the early 1950s, challenges to the Met's color line accelerated, and Anderson was often involved, both on stage and off. Be aware that each of the firsts that I'm about to chronicle exposes just how long white supremacy dominated the Met. 1951 was a critical year. That January, Duke Ellington and his orchestra rented the Met for a concert on behalf of the NAACP. Once again, gifted performers of color occupied the hall, and Marian Anderson was among the chairs of the benefit. In March, Fred Thomas, a young black baritone from Norristown, Pennsylvania, was among 3 winners of the Met's Auditions of the Air, a contest with over 700 entrants. In October, a much publicized breakthrough occurred when the Met signed the African-American ballerina Janet Collins as one of 2 principal dancers. In November, the New York Post reported, quote, for the first time, am I on the right? Yes. For the first time in the history of the Metropolitan Opera's dressy openings, Negroes were admitted last night to the swanky Sherry's Bar, admitted to the bar in the Met for the first time, where patrons relax at intermission. Marian Anderson, the famous singer, was one of the Negroes served. That same month, 4 black singers appeared in the chorus of Cavalleria Rusticana, thus breaking, the Aida pattern as reported in the Atlanta Daily World, another black paper. In 1953, Robert McFerrin became the first African American to be sole winner of the Metropolitan Opera of the Air auditions. That same year, Anderson was back at the Met on Easter Sunday for a solo concert. Then in 1954, Sylvia Olden Lee became the first African American on the Met staff. A brilliant pianist and vocal coach, Lee worked with multiple generations of singers, including Shirley Verrett, Kathleen Battle, and Jesse Norman. That October, Anderson signed with the Met for an appearance the following January. Thus, when Anderson finally made her Met debut in January 1955, it was not only a triumph over the racism of that institution, but it also issued a challenge to segregationist practices in classical music venues across the country. At the same time, there was the issue of the racialized othering of Marian Anderson through the character of Ulrika. Only a few cultural critics at the time seemed to notice the links to blackface, and they worked for African American newspapers. This was an era when the notion of colorblind casting, as we perceive it today, did not exist, and the practices of blackface were alive and well on stage and screen. Among those alert to racial representation was Dean Gordon Hancock of the American Negro Press, a national syndicate, who wrote an article pointing out the implications of what had actually transpired in Anderson's premiere. He concluded, curiously, Anderson was playing 2 roles, a member of the vile race of the Negroes, as you will recall, that's how Ulrika is labeled in the script, and an arch pioneer in finally bringing democracy to an operatic institution of which all Americans should be unanimously proud. Correspondence in the Met Archive shows the combination of strong support and racist condemnation that greeted Anderson's debut. One fan wrote Bing to quote, express my humble admiration for your courageous decision. There was also hate mail, such as a letter signed by John KKK here in Philadelphia, who threatened that Anderson's appearance, quote, is an insult to the white people. The end will only come by bloodshed. Responses varied among African Americans. The Urban League of Eastern Union County, New Jersey, sent a telegram to Bing commending him for demonstrating, quote, the real spirit of democracy. On the other hand, Chester Hampton, writing in the Atlanta Daily World, held the opera company responsible for the tenacity of its Jim Crow history. Quote, the Met certainly is entitled to no bravos for recognizing Miss Anderson now after having failed to do so for so many years. For Marian Anderson, who was 58 in 1955, there was no opportunity for a career in opera. Rather, she used her celebrity to crack open the door for others. First, Robert McFerrin, Matilda Dobbs, and Gloria Davy, then Leontine Price, and after that, a major era of black stars. To conclude, I've argued here that the Metropolitan Opera imposed unrelenting structural racism from its founding in 1883 until Marian Anderson's debut 72 years later. An extended concert-by-concert civil rights strategy preceded Anderson's ultimate breakthrough with the opera company, and Saul Hierroch took on the role of manager-activist to produce results. Significantly, Hierroch's rental of the Met Building for Anderson's annual solo concerts succeeded in packing an otherwise predominantly white space with interracial audiences, and it deployed the uplifting symbolism of Easter to argue for inclusion. Circling back to Pauli Murray, she asserted that as of 1951, quote, "In no other field than civil rights is the law more unsettled." As histories of the civil rights movement have subsequently taught us, the process of settling was incremental and often intensely local, and it eventually forced the passage of more inclusive legislation, even as so many issues remain unresolved. Marian Anderson, together with Saul Hierroch, played a major role in this ground game, reportedly taking risks to force change. The ultimate impact of Anderson's actions has long been recognized, but only with the digitizing of black newspapers, essentially the democratizing of those sources, which were not even indexed before, has it become ever more apparent how she and Hierroch deployed an intentional, long-range strategy to confront, then topple, Jim Crow at the Met. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for a very moving presentation for all of us. Questions? There, in the back.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Norton from Ithaca, New York. I'm really interested in the role of Hierroch, and I'm wondering if you have examined that, and did he work with other African Americans too, or just Marian Anderson?
He was primarily a manager of Russian ballet. He had some other solo artists, but it was mostly ballet companies. So Anderson was a singular case for him. Hierroch was himself a refugee from pogroms in Russia. He was very left-wing politically. He was involved in unionizing when he was first in the U.S. So he had a strong progressive streak in him. And with Anderson, it just kind of seems like as events came up, they just were imaginatively figured out strategies. So, they were sort of doing it by the seat of their pants. But I don't see any evidence of him having done this in any broad-based way. At the same time as, Russians touring the world as ballet dancers were not always the most welcome people either. So, he was dealing with similar issues at times.
So the strategy.
Can you say who you are and
I'm
where you're
Toby
from?
Pearl Freilich.
Thank
I'm a
you.
filmmaker. So the strategy of renting out the Metropolitan Opera House, was there any blowback for Saul Hierroch once they got wind of the fact of his, they had a whites-only policy? Was there punitive measures taken? It appears he did it more than once. So they never got wind of that? Did they try to prevent him from doing that ever again?
Yeah, so the Metropolitan Opera did not, on the books, have a whites-only policy as Constitution Hall did. Constitution Hall's contracts, on the front page, I've gone through them, contracts with more performers than you can imagine, performers of major reputation. Everybody was just signing these contracts. On the front page, they say white artists only. So the Metropolitan Opera was not doing that. They simply were not signing any contract. It was all silent. So in terms of blowback, I really haven't found much yet. I'm finding this book to be probably the hardest thing I've ever researched. I mean, I'm sort of looking for crumbs, and it's difficult. But no, I mean, the answer to that is no. So, but what I haven't done is say maybe look in the right-wing press. I mean, I don't know if they would have cared much about what's going on at the Metropolitan Opera. So,
Are there questions at the balcony? No, here, down here, thank you.
David Tatel, Washington, D.C. That was totally fascinating, thank you. As you were speaking, I couldn't get out of my head the parallel effort to desegregate baseball. Did you see any evidence in the papers you looked at that Marian Anderson and Jackie Robinson knew each other?
I've not seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised that they turned up at similar events. I mean, so much of this effort just had to do with being seen, and it's possible, but I'm sorry. I don't know that. But you're right that these are parallel battles going on at the same time. Same with desegregating the military. Yeah.
Yes, here.
Why a white accompanist? Couldn't she find a black accompanist? Or was that part of the strategy?
Oh, no, it wasn't part of the strategy. It was just part of her. Musically, this was someone she worked well with, Franz Rupp. He was preceded by a Finnish accompanist. Both of them she met during her long travels in Europe. The Finnish accompanist was Kosti Vähänen. And before that, there was an accompanist from here in Philadelphia who was black, who was with her initially, and then, I mean, there's some pretty heated correspondence between them when things fell apart. And it seems that she felt artistically she was outgrowing him, and so she chose her art. But yes, it would have been ideal to have a black accompanist, but that didn't happen.
Question here.
Bill Hook from Springfield, Virginia. Could you say something, was Marian Anderson involved in mentoring or fostering the progress of others during this whole period?
Oh, yes. For one thing, she started a vocal competition, which goes on today, and which has a cash prize, which helps young people get funds to study, but then also brings recognition. So I'd say that's one big way. And other things, like as I mentioned today with the Met, she would just sort of open up a door and then others could come through it. So another mentoring case is was her nephew, the conductor James DePriest. I mean, she supported him mightily throughout his career. He was assistant conductor with the New York Philharmonic for a while. So no, she tended to her children.
Yes.
Paul Friedman at Yale. We spoke about the little-known fact that I'm named after Paul Robeson, but not so much in comparing Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson's careers or efforts to overcome Jim Crow, but the left-wing press. My impression from my parents and growing up in that environment is that things like the National Guardian or even the Daily Worker are great advocates, I mean, for reasons that are not completely selfless, of integration and of exalting the accomplishments of what they would have referred to as Negro performers. I wonder if you've looked at any of that literature as well as the right-wing press.
Oh, I have. And the People's Voice, too, which was a left-wing Harlem newspaper in the 40s, going into the 50s, she was covered a lot there. I mean, the thing with Anderson is that she was pretty quiet about her politics, even quiet about her racial stance. I mean, it all had to do with, I kept using the phrase showing up. That was her means of protest. She showed up to perform in unbelievable situations, mean, with police protection, with the KKK outside. This happened in Florida in the early 1950s. Just staggering situations. But she never personally made political statements or strong statements about segregation and the need to get rid of it. So that separated her from Robeson. I mean, they overlapped in many venues, but they had entirely different approaches to the way they presented their art and their politics. And I'm guessing, as a woman who grew up poor, the stakes must have felt just huge. She was supporting her mother and her two sisters. There wasn't a lot of room for error.
We have
Michelle
time for
McDonald. Oh,
time for yes, I think here. Good.
sorry, Michelle McDonald, Philadelphia. So part of my question was asked by the last presenter, but though I wasn't talking about the press, I was interested in Anderson's relationship to Robeson, partly because I was so struck in the clip that you showed about her incorporation of spirituals, which of course was where Robeson, that was his foundation and entry into the music. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about their choice to include African-American spirituals in their performances and what that might be saying about their form of choosing to express their cultural and political stance, because I do see that as a political act.
Indeed, it was. Yes, well, this, by the 1920s, I'm not sure of the exact date, had become fairly routine for Black performers to end a recital with a group of spirituals, whereas, a white performer might end with a group of folk songs, or maybe a folk song and a popular tune, or something of the sort. It was instead spirituals. So Anderson did this routinely. Robeson also did it. Harry Burleigh, way before both of them, was doing so. Roland Hayes was doing so. It was just a standard part of the identity of a Black concert artist, singer.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
that was
thank you.
the last question. It's very moving.
Thank you.
That was lovely, Carol. Thank you.